Welcome to this recording of the Activist Lawyer podcast, brought to you from the Granite Podcast Studio in the heart of Newry City. We are delighted that you could join us at Activist Lawyer, where we will be discussing a range of topical matters engaging not only with lawyers, but people who are committed to highlighting and combating injustices and inequalities. We will bring you our thoughts, but invite you to share yours. We'll be looking for contributors to our blog at activistlawyer.com, as we want your perspective as we unravel and unpack a host of issues. My name is Sarah Henry and I'm a solicitor practising in Newry City. I worked with a human rights firm in Dublin for many years and with a number of rights-based organisations and charities. I'm looking forward to meeting some fantastic guests throughout this series. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us again on this episode. Jack in the studio.
Hello everybody.
Jack is here again. So we had a really interesting discussion with a solicitor based in Dublin in the firm KOD Lyons. It's Stephen Kirwan, and really, we say this about everybody, but we actually could have talked all day. There's so much. He was so uplifting and
very inspirational, definitely for young students. I'm inspired now.
So really, I suppose we touch on a lot of things, but really this episode will really resonate with people who want to get into the practice of human rights and public law, and just listen to his advice and his motivation for him getting into it. So just a brief introduction. Stephen joined KOD Lyons Solicitors in 2013. He specialises in public interest law. He was made associate of the firm in January 2021 and is currently the head of the Immigration and International Law Department, with responsibility for identifying and initiating public interest law challenges in a variety of cases. And you'll hear Stephen is from Westmeath, but he's a massive fan of Newry.
Massive fan of the butter crane.
That's a first for anybody on our show. So he's a huge fan of the butter crane. We hope to see him up in the butter crane or the Keys or somewhere in Newry. But look, it was fantastic to talk to him, and we hope you enjoy it. It's great to have you contribute to Activist Lawyer, Stephen.
I'm delighted to be here, and again, thank you so much for the invite. It does the ego the world of good.
Well, that's good for us to know. That gives us a bit of an ego boost too, doesn't it, Jack? So, as listeners just heard, Stephen works with KOD Lyons in Dublin. It's a firm, we had a wee chat there about it as well, that I'm very familiar with. I think we went through a big list of names there. Jack's probably sitting bored listening to us say, oh, I know her. Yeah, I used to work with her. But I worked in Dublin, obviously, with a human rights and immigration firm, quite similar to yours, I think, in many respects, Stephen, and qualified and trained there. So it's fantastic for us to have you and practitioners like yourself check in with us here in Activist Lawyer to keep track of developments and the excellent public law and human rights work carried out by solicitors like yourself. So thank you.
Brilliant. And again, thanks very much.
Not at all. So lots of our listeners have connected with us, and we've had quite a few guests on recently who've really been remarkable. We've had great feedback. And we still have students and younger people, I suppose, aspiring lawyers who are interested in getting into law, especially into human rights or public law matters. So we were lucky to have guests provide us with real insights into their work. And so I think we'll start off with yourself in a similar vein, and invite you to share your background leading up to your current areas of expertise, just a bit about your work.
Sure. And again, I suppose not to go back to birth on these things, but it always tends to go that way.
Doesn't it?
So my parents, I'm the son of two Irish immigrants who moved to Boston in the late 80s. And I was born there, and I suppose obviously you can imagine there somewhere deep in the subconscious, somewhere there obviously had an affinity with the idea of immigration and being an immigrant or you know, trying to integrate into community that way. So I suppose I'd always been interested that way, and an interest in politics. I moved back to Ireland with my parents when I was about 7. And again, I'm not going to say, not to go through the life story, but again, I had been interested in politics as I grew up, particularly Irish-American politics, given my background. And then I suppose when it came to doing my leaving certificate at the time, I suppose law seemed like the obvious choice, given that I was very interested in political activism and in history, but also, you know, had an idea or certainly a conception of how law should be. I mean, I think a lot of idealistic young people do think you can change the world. I was fortunate enough then to get into Trinity College, where I studied on the LLB programme. and got heavily involved with the Trinity Free Legal Advice Centre, which again, I'm not sure if some of your listeners are familiar with it, but it's not only a huge movement here in the Republic, but again has very much a focus on activist lawyering and trying to make positive change for particular interest groups. And then I suppose, look, I finished my undergraduate degree in 2012, and I think like a lot of people across the whole island didn't really know what to do next. We were in a situation where training contracts probably weren't the norm. There wasn't a whole pile happening in terms of the economy, save for maybe people leaving the jurisdiction. Yeah. And I decided to go onto a research program straight from my undergrad, because I had published kind of in the area of penal policy and natural justice and constitutional reform and issues like that. So again, I decided to go that way, and I got a phone call one day to attend a talk that was been given by Gareth Noble, who's actually a partner in the firm now, and knew nothing about KOD lines at the time, and went to see Gareth and was just inspired. Genuinely took my breath away listening to him speak. And again, as I said, I was formerly the chair of Trinity FLAC. I had done a lot of activist work that way. I just could not believe that this could be a potential option. Yeah. And it really did inspire me. So of course, a number of months passed, and they had a summer training program at the time, and I thought, well, this is the place for me. Threw my application in, came in for 2 weeks, and 8 years later, I'm still here. so there you go.
And you've crammed a lot into that space of time. We've been looking at some of the work you've been doing, and we're familiar. Obviously, we do immigration primarily here. Jack, you had a look. There was something, and then we realised Stephen's firm were actually involved in it.
Yeah, so we were looking at some cases and then doing a bit of research into you, Stephen, before the podcast, and seeing that you've covered, as you've said, a number of areas. But one that stood out to us was the challenge to the ban on driver licence for asylum seekers. If you could just explain to the listeners who don't know just about the ban and then the subsequent challenge, if you'd like to explain to the listeners.
Sure, absolutely. So basically, the challenge emanated from the fact that we have quite a large asylum practice here in the office, our international protection practice. Ultimately, what the rules suggest, or the way in which the rules have been promulgated, acts as an effective ban on those who are in the international protection process on seeking a driver's license, or to sit a test, or even to exchange their licenses, on the basis that they impose a residence condition. And it's the way in which those regulations are interpreted, we say, are unlawful. Now, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission have taken a separate case focusing on the aspect of discrimination. So what they say is, that there's no, ultimately their argument, which was unsuccessful before the High Court, very unfortunately, but was that it's tantamount to an unlawful discrimination. Whereas we say, I suppose in our case, which is a little wider, because we had the privilege of not having to go through the appeals mechanism. We're looking at a much wider judicial review on whether or not that's lawful as a matter of European law, with reference to the reception conditions directive, and also in relation to other constitutional interpretive points, and whether or not, in fact, the regulations are outside of the primary legislation. So, look, it's an interesting challenge. We had a hearing date in October, and I think we have 4 or 5 clients in behind it. And Sarah, I think you probably know yourself from your days in Dublin and doing human rights practice down here. That's often tends to be the case, that you start to see issues repeating themselves as they come in. And as I say, we have Kirwan Doherty is the junior barrister, and Michael Lynn, who's both gentlemen are absolute lions when it comes to human rights and equality law. Absolutely. And we're all very passionate about the point. Yeah. So we're very hopeful it'll succeed.
It is. And I mean, it's in the wider context, that point is very relevant, because it's the first time we're actually seeing political movement around direct provision, which indeed, of course, is where most asylum seekers, many of whom are waiting for years and years, and we've seen horrible press coverage about deaths within direct provision centres. And, it's startling that people have not realised that practice has been going on for, isn't it, over 20 years or more in Ireland. And it's the first time that I've really seen issues impacting asylum seekers come to light publicly as such. The driver's licence is an issue, the right to work and the abhorrent living conditions for children, parents. And so it's good that these matters are finally, coming to the fore. And I think obviously a great legal team there behind that. So that's really interesting. And just another point that I was personally interested in, just because of our work here, you'll know I used to do a lot of EU treaty rights cases, and of course this is all under the pillar of the Directive of Free Movement, which sadly, we can no longer rely on that in this part of the world, in the north. Yeah. But you have obviously, and I mean, the problem there is that they've really, decades of case law has been built up around EU treaty rights, and overnight practically in the UK that's just vanished, and they're putting in place other kind of procedures. But you had two interesting Court of Justice references around dependence of EU national workers as well. Is there any update on that?
Yeah, so again, they're very, very interesting. Well, sorry. Again, I always find this when I'm talking to fellow lawyers and law students. We find these things very fascinating, in terms of procedural challenges, and I hope other people also find them interesting. But certainly, to me, it's about the human interest behind these stories. And as I said, to me, that's what it's about. Mm-hmm. So I suppose one challenge is in relation to the Child Benefit Directive and the interpretation of when someone is entitled to child benefit as a worker, even if an application hasn't been lodged for child benefit, and how those rules work. Mm-hmm. So that's, I suppose, a bit more of a niche challenge. And we got a reference from Mr. Justice Humphreys in that case in January. That case is the Stan case. I suppose the more interesting, wider challenge is the decision, which is it's currently before the Court of Appeal, but they've indicated that they're going to give a reference in it, the case called Voitan and the Chief Appeals Officer. And basically what that deals with is exactly that. It's cases of EU workers who have been living here, who are working away and have brought their parents or elderly dependents here for various reasons. I mean, again, to provide support. I know myself, I'd be lost if I didn't have my parents and my wife's parents, as childminders and to help us out. And really, the point in that case is whether or not, ultimately, if someone is a direct dependent on an EU citizen, whether or not they lose that dependency if they then go to seek financial assistance. Yeah. And our point is, very much that the case law from Europe points very much in our favour. We're hopeful that the European Court will continue to give a very expansive interpretation on, free movement rights and those, particularly those who are direct dependents on EU nationals. And I think it's very disingenuous of the state to be fighting these types of cases, personally speaking.
Absolutely.
I understand why they do, and everything comes down to economics and to money. But I think when you see and when you're presented with a case of clients who are literally trying to make ends meet, you have one person who's working as hard as they possibly can to try and maintain a full family. It does kind of stick in your craw a little bit when you see them fighting someone over what is tantamount to maybe a couple of €100 a month. And I think that's why, I'm so delighted to be here talking to other activist lawyers, because I think you probably feel the same when you're faced with these situations and you're looking at them in a micro context,
You are, and we're dealing with it now with the legacy of the free movement cases kind of transitioning into the EU settlement scheme for a very short period of time left in that. But again, this issue of dependency arises, and it's down to the pounds, shillings and pence. And you're really, it's not looking at it in the broader context. It's more difficult here because this is a new area that we're getting into. But again, like yourself, you're seeing grandparents and, families who've been living here or who have made the decision to move, and it's interesting to see how the Home Office will in fact interpret the law or the policy that they've laid out in this kind of very strange post-Brexit era. But yes, we'll keep.
It's a tough one. It's a tough one for you to deal with, I have to say. And
it is,
I know
there's no precedent, and anyone we speak to, any of our practitioners, we have a great circle of people up here, fantastic immigration lawyers, and we just bounce ideas off each other, and nobody has a real sense of what's going to come next.
And I think what's difficult for practitioners in your space, I don't know, Bryony Rest, who works with David Gray solicitors in Newcastle, she's part of a sister firm. We're part of an independent law group, and I know I've spoken to her on a number of occasions, and really what keeps the system running is lawyers like you, Sarah, and people like Jack, and people like Bryony, who are willing to stand up and do what's right. And that, to be honest with you, we're often much maligned as a profession. You always hear about, fat cat lawyers and, legal aid fees being too high.
Yes.
But really it's this type of work that people decide they don't want to publish. Yeah.
No. It's not about the money. No. But
no, certainly not.
It certainly isn't. But so lots to talk about with immigration. I think for us it's great to have, because we're on the border here as well in Newry, we dip in and out of both jurisdictions. So it's just an interesting time to see how things develop and regress perhaps up here. But just moving on, because I could talk about immigration all day. I tend to get wrapped up in it, but we'll do that again, Stephen. Just getting back to something I know recently you've been involved in, and it's something Jack and I have chatted about loosely in a number of episodes, but it's you've been really homing in on one particular aspect of this, although you've covered it generally. But we've been looking at the appalling abuse and institutionalisation of women and children in Ireland through mother and baby homes and the Magdalen laundries. We spoke before about the Commissioner's report that issued at the beginning of this year, and we found it very tough to listen to the horrific testimonies that followed that report. We know there was an apology from Taoiseach, but serious matters continue to haunt the families of victims and survivors. And I know you and KOD Lyons and practitioners like yourselves have been involved in some of these issues and the wider case in general. But can you just maybe let listeners have your kind of thoughts on this matter, because it's still very relevant, and I think there's certain issues that are going to continue to arise out of this that we're not really fully aware of yet. But just in terms of your connection with the survivors of the Mother and Baby Institutes over the years, how has that been going?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I was very concerned with this issue for a long time. So my former colleague, Wendy Lyne, who's now, and again, another great activist lawyer, who set up with another former colleague of mine, Elizabeth Mitro and Abbey Law, first introduced me to the idea of the Magdalen Scheme at the time when I was training here, and the horrific abuses that occurred there. And we're starting to see a lot of the same issues emerging. And I know, again, in the north, I know there's going to be investigations coming down the track as well. My understanding is that Dr. Maeve O'Rourke will be leading certain investigations in relation to that. And anyway, to come back to it, I suppose, really, I suppose our challenges, we have a number of different involvement, a number of different avenues of involvement with the mother and baby home cases. So, I mean, the first thing is that we represent a number of people who gave confidential testimony to the committee. And, it was premised, or supposed to have been premised, on the Commission of Investigation Act 2004, where there were certain procedural rights given in relation to testimony presented, the right to view it, the right to essentially cross-examine it, and an issue of response. That seemed to have been thrown out the window. That was kind of my first involvement in it. We've taken a number of challenges on foot of that now, which again were publicised in the media, I suppose. And really those cases were, to me, another slap in the face for survivors who were not only disappointed with the Commission's work because it wasn't as extensive possibly as it could have been. They had a number of genuine complaints about not being listened to properly or considered. And then to have their testimony placed in the public record to be essentially either spliced or, changed or misrepresented, while also having unique identifying features to them and not giving them a chance to respond to it, was a real slap in the face for those survivors. I suppose in terms of then the Bessborough group, I mean, I'm involved with a group called the Cork Survivors and Supporters Alliance. And I've helped them in a planning dispute with On Board Planala, where the developer, MWB2, are essentially looking to build a block of apartments. Where, I mean, we say that there is evidence that there was a children's burial ground, ultimately where they're looking to build now. I mean, again, we're waiting on the decision, so it would be interesting to see how On Board Planala actually deal with it. But to me, what really struck me, I mean, outside of what our group were advocating for, which was, proper memorialisation and respect. Yeah. There was a brilliant piece from two survivors, so Mary Slattery and another lady called Terry Harrison. And I mean, their point was essentially, you wouldn't see this in places like, and again, not to make a direct comparison with the Holocaust, because I don't think that's appropriate, but I can see the idea of what they were suggesting, absolutely, which was you wouldn't see you building a monument like this in Dachau. You wouldn't see them just building apartments there. Wholly inappropriate in my view. Now, look, my clients, the CSSA, are absolutely in favour of reasonable and sensible development, but in an alternative location. And look, we'll see what On Board Planala eventually come up with. Yeah. But it's another slap in the face. And look, Sarah, you probably know yourself, dealing with survivors, who come through the system like that. Yeah. There's a massive amount of distrust for authority and scepticism. Yeah. Even for lawyers. I mean, they are sceptical, and rightly so when you see the type of things that continue to happen. And then I suppose, finally on it, there's a proposal for some sort of a redress scheme that doesn't fully engage with the wider survivor community. No. The proposal is essentially as it stands, and although the Dáil there is a select committee to look at some of the issues. I mean, their proposals are far too narrow, and what they're doing is they're preferring certain survivors over others without giving any sort of a logical or logistical basis. So, to be honest, that's the hardest part in dealing with these cases. The trauma that has occurred is extremely bad, but it's to see this ongoing victimisation. It really does.
And I mean, that was
really hard.
That was the concern that campaigners and, I mean, people like Catherine Corliss, who of course was instrumental in all of this, the local historian in Tuam in County Galway, who uncovered the burial ground there. But as you say, the apology was one thing, but they didn't. They want action. People want action. And you're right, this is like a slap in the face. And I remember years ago dealing with a redress scheme, for survivors of boys' homes in Letterfrack and different parts of Ireland. And again, that distrust is so prominent, and you're right, for lawyers as well. And you're seeing how, the money means nothing. It doesn't really address it's so narrow. So you would think this time round, given the report, given the huge public outcry as well, that that would be the end of it, and these people and survivors and their families would see proper justice.
Absolutely. And all I can say this time, compared to maybe previous times that we have been involved, as I said, even with the Magdalen cases, politicians, for the first time, certainly that I can remember, are really sitting up and paying attention and wanting to be activist politicians, which again you would expect goes with the territory, but you would be surprised the level of resistance you would normally meet. But I mean, we represented the CSSA before an Oireachtas subcommittee in relation to the burials bill, which is a controversial bill to deal with some of these legacy issues and how they're going to deal with these types of cases. And all I can tell you is I've never seen cross-party support like it. We had Kathleen Funchion, who was there, Mary Siri Carney, Erin McGeehan, Lynn Rowan, a number of people from cross-party agreeing pretty much agreeing across the board that something has to be done, and that ultimately money was no object.
Yeah.
Which again is surprising. Now, look, I suppose politicians might say one thing and do something else, but even to have that on the record, to the survivors, they feel listened to, and I think it is important. And I also feel awkward kind of speaking on behalf of supporters. I've been asked, as you can imagine, because it's gotten so much public traction, to kind of, make comments in papers and stuff. And I tend to decline, because I think, the problem with a lot of these cases is you have the white fella from the middle of the country, who's came from a very, very, very happy home and a great existence, and didn't have the problems or the persecution of a system on him, and then he's meant to stand up and kind of speak up. It's a funny position, and I have to say the survivors have always been very, very complimentary and always very helpful. But it's an interesting space, and as I said, I imagine it's a feeling felt by a lot of lawyers in this space that there are times when we just have to sit back and listen, and it's a hard skill to learn. It's a hard skill to learn, particularly when you might see a legal avenue for redress or a great point from the European Convention, that you might try and run. But it's not your case and it's not your point, and it's always important to remember that, I think.
Yeah, well, look, that's a really kind of a humble way to look at it. But I guess you're right. The thing is as well, I think it's a collective effort. And I know here, just looking at what's happening in Northern Ireland on the back of the Commissioner's report, we've spoken to solicitors who've been leading the way on this too, and they, similarly to yourself, they've said that as well. It's important to just sit back and make sure this is survivor centric, and work with the organisations like Amnesty in Northern Ireland have been very vocal on it, and even the survivors groups yourself, like you mentioned one there, have been absolutely fantastic. So it's a real collective effort, I think, in pulling these forwards. I suppose Northern Ireland have the advantage of only starting really to delve into this now, looking what has been done in the South. And I think a positive thing, like you said, Dr. Maeve O'Rourke, I think Phil Scranton, there's a number of others who are there to take advice from the survivors as to how they're going to start this investigation, or how the executive are going to help with this.
And where I think the executive have actually made a very positive step in the North is by bringing in someone of Maeve's expertise.
Absolutely.
And knowledge. I mean, an unbelievable campaigner. But as I say, the lessons that you would learn from the likes of Dr. O'Rourke and from, people in the NGO sector is that it is important that you're not pushing your agenda, because it's very easy for us all to do it. And I have to say, it does keep you humble as a lawyer, when you might spot a brilliant legal point or something that you think is great, but you always have to bear in mind that it's not your instructions and it's not you that has to deal with the legacy. And that was something I struggled with, because, we always think we have a good sense of justice, but really it has to be victim and survivor centric. And if it's not, it's a waste of time doing it. The great thing about the process that's been envisaged in the North is that you do have good people there who are very, very keen, very attuned with those issues.
I think so. It was refreshing to see that that announcement made there a couple of months ago. So hopefully they'll get on with that, and we'll see some movement around here. And again, it would be interesting to check in with yourself again, Stephen, to see how you and KOD Lions are getting along with your cases too. Just something, so we're kind of moving from one thing to another, but there's too much to cover with you. But Jack and I, again, not to kind of linger on this point, but you had a few interesting
it's a topic that will be talked about for a long time. But as Stephen, we were speaking before we pressed the record button, you were listening to the Colin Harvey podcast episode, and I know that you've been following this topic in terms of promoting a cross-community, cross-border discussion on this matter, as it is such a significant constitutional issue. The theme of a new or shared Ireland is widely debated and will be widely debated for a long time, both North and South. But given your position in Dublin, in the Republic of Ireland, I'm keen to know your thoughts on the topic of a shared island and how we might organise and structure an inclusive debate such as a citizens' assembly.
Brilliant, and I'm delighted to comment on it, Jack. And I tell you, it's one of those ones, again, you kind of feel a little uncomfortable speaking about sometimes. And maybe it's because I'm on Twitter too much. I'll be honest with you, that's probably what it is. We kind of get thrown, and look, it can be a toxic place at times, but sometimes you get a feeling of a sentiment or a mood. And, like, you always feel like an imposter. So, like, what I mean is that the view from, certain people of political persuasion in the north of people from the Republic is that, where these, we love, the only thing we love about the north is tipping up to the butter crane shopping centre in Newry and buying a cheap bottle of vodka.
You'll knock it up now. You'll be sitting in traffic for 3 hours.
Well, there you go, exactly, and singing rebel tunes and doing all that type of stuff, but not really knowing about anything and not really engaging with discourse. And that, look, to be honest with you, I understand that sentiment, and it is a difficult one, and it's a question that's been avoided, really, and it's a shame, I suppose, well, certainly from my perspective, that more people aren't discussing this more clearly. I have to say, from a legal perspective, it's funny even how the discourse and the narrative around the shared island, particularly through the work of Emma D'Souza, who I know was also on your podcast.
Yes, she was.
And Colin Harvey. It's brilliant to see that it's not really about the orange and green, and I think that is, I think that the discourse has to develop in another way. From a legal perspective, I mean, in the South, you have the likes of David Kenny and Oran Doyle, who've discussed for a number of years about, well, how will it look in terms of the framework and what legal procedures are going to be put in place, and how is it going to work in terms of mechanics. And it's only now that they're starting to engage in the substance of, well, what does it look like? Jim O'Callaghan, again, I know was referenced the other day. It's things like, issues that are of importance, the symbolic things like flags and things like, taxation. Those issues are now starting to be discussed and debated. But I think within that, what's really, really important is that we keep a focus, not necessarily on a united Ireland, but a shared island.
Yeah.
And I think that was a really striking theme of Colin Harvey's podcast yesterday, which is that, look, and to do that, I think, we need to be thinking about, well, what are the human rights norms and mechanisms that we want to talk about? What are the ones that we do share? And whether or not, when we're coming up with a solution, is it going to be, different to maybe what we would have seen in the 2000s? I mean, how are we going to structure this arrangement that way? But I think it has to be premised on a debate about, well, what do we want? And I think in terms of the South, there's a lot of apathy in terms of the wider question. But I do think it's funny because the same people who are maybe apathetic about the question are the ones who also want domestic reform in terms of rights protection and political change. And I think that could be the way, or the hook, I suppose, to get people talking about it, Jack, you mentioned about the idea of nearly a citizens' assembly. I mean, I think that is an absolute must. And I think anyone who's talking about a border poll happening, I mean, that's a matter for obviously the citizens of the North to make their decision on that, as opposed to, as I said, some lawyer from the South coming in and saying it needs to happen. But I think having firm timelines in place is extremely important. And I think the way, the preemptor to that is to have some sort of a shared island assembly. Yeah, definitely, for sure.
Yeah. Absolutely. I know, and we're discussing it in different times now. I mean, there's so much context to this. It's such a vast debate that sometimes it's hard to get your head around it, but I think it's fantastic. And I mean, for us, Jack, this podcast has been brilliant, the likes of yourself, Stephen, and people on giving their perspective, but it's an exciting time too, and it's bringing up lots of issues, I suppose, that have been kind of left out of broader public discussions in an All-Ireland basis
and I think it's important. I think it's important because we don't want to take it for granted.
No.
And I think it's incumbent on people who want to keep the system the way it is to justify it. I really do. And I think initiatives like you have here where, and again, I'm very humbled to be a guest here, but I think it's really important because we share so much, as an island, regardless of what your political bent is.
Exactly.
And a lot of this discourse and narrative does need to happen.
Absolutely. Well, we look forward to progressing that again. We've some interesting guests coming up that I think you'll like to listen to. But just the question that we ask all of our guests is around the concept of activist lawyer. And you yourself clearly have not shied away from representing the vulnerable in society, and also through your work. I mean, it's a vast array there of clients that you've been able to act in respect of and make change happen, which is the crucial thing. But just from your perspective, how important do you think activism is today? And what advice would you, Stephen, have for our listeners who would like to get involved in your type of work or become active, I suppose, even outside of law in respect of a particular matter that they're passionate about?
I think it's vital. Okay, and I think the reason that I think activism is vital as a profession, whether you're a barrister or a solicitor or whatever role you have within a firm, I think it's important that we are heard, because law as a tool, and again, without getting too philosophical on it, but I mean, it's a political tool, and it's a tool that demands change, and it's a tool that demands people to stand up and to advocate. Now, being an advocate doesn't mean, that you're pushing an agenda for your own good. It's that you're hearing what people are saying and trying to push it that way. In terms of advice that I'd have is simply, look, get involved, get active, right? Whether it be from a political perspective, for me in the Republic, I mean, I've said groups like FLAC, the Free Legal Advice Centre, the Penal Reform Trust. I think it's vitally important. The other thing I'd say to people who are focused on doing this type of work is dispel yourself of any sort of a notion that it's a handy gig, right? There are long days, there are late nights, there are times when you are in a very, very bad place in terms of, you could have had a very, very bad week, it could be tough. You're dealing with clients who are extremely vulnerable and bring their own baggage, particularly in the asylum case. I mean, you're talking about people who are fleeing persecution, who are skeptical of authority, and then you're coming in, trying to solve the world's problems. It doesn't happen overnight. No. You do have to have a lot of patience, okay? And again, Sarah, I'm sure from your own work, you can attest to that. Things do not happen overnight. No. Legal points don't just spring up overnight. And I would say, look, to law students, I know you're probably sick of hearing this, right? Because every lecturer under the sun told me to do it when I was in my undergrad. Don't know if I fully appreciated it, but read as much as you can, okay? Not only in terms of, judgments themselves, but kind of, as I said, the political side of things and knowing the context to how things have arisen, I think is important. Yeah. I mean, other than that, just never be afraid, I think it's really, really important, particularly in today's climate, that we're not marginalised or disenfranchised for having a view. Mainstream media, and again, without putting the tinfoil hat on, there's a lot of stuff that appears in papers as a way to try and somehow balance the discussion. But there shouldn't be, right? That's not how it works. How it works is that you individually have to get out there and make your voice heard. And I just think it's extremely important. And, particularly in both North and in the Republic here, that all lawyers are looking at that common purpose. It's not necessarily, again, as Emma pointed out, not necessarily, green and orange. This is more about societal issues and how we want to take control of, the discourse. As students generally, and as people who are interested in politics, most lawyers in this space would be, we're very privileged. We really, really are very privileged. And as I say, there's times when it doesn't feel like it, but I can tell you, stick at it. It's the biggest thing I could say.
It's so worthwhile, and it's tough. And you need a bit of grit there, and just everything you say, I can completely resonate. And Jack's starting off on his journey now into this world, and I'm sure this is really kind of important advice for you, Jack.
Yeah, definitely.
But it's important, Jack, just to point out, and again, just speaking to you, obviously personally here on the phone, I mean, you're showing extremely good fundamentals of what it takes to be a lawyer here. You're asking the questions, you're thinking about these issues. And that is really what is the difference at the end of the day between an average lawyer. Look, we're all, there's good and bad everywhere, but the really, really exceptional lawyers, the Wendy Lyons of this world, the Aoife McNichols, the Sheens, the up and coming lawyers here are ones who are just not willing to give up. They're willing to fight, even when it looks hopeless. And that, to be honest with you, is probably where we get the most fun out of wins there, I'm sure, when it looks like we have no hope, you know.
And there's so many resources out there. I mean, just not to labour on this, and this is another point for discussion, but even with volunteering and, you know, getting involved with groups. I remember hounding the Refugee Council in Dublin for a long time, literally begging for an internship. And somebody, I think it was actually Ciara Smith, and who taught me in Galway University, human rights lawyer, that got me in the end. But it's just having that determination and grit. And it is hard. It's hard going. But at the end of the day, it's so rewarding. And I think that advice, Stephen, is absolutely just
thank you very much,
spot
Stephen,
on for our listeners. So thank you so much for joining. We covered so much, but again, we could go on for quite a long time. We hope to have you back on,
and
Stephen.
hopefully we can meet for a pint near the butter train sometime soon. Unfortunately, as a real good Southerner, that's all I know when I think of Newry. There's so much more to see.
There's so much more. There's the keys as well.
I'm sure we'll go to Primark, Steve.
Exactly. We'll tip up to Warren Point for an afternoon or something.
Absolutely, you're more than welcome. And well, look, it's been fantastic. And again, thank you for joining us, and we'll get you back on again soon.
Thanks, Steve.
No problem at all. Thanks so much.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team, using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.